Hello, everybody. It's Mrs. Wallace. So I'm going to, look at this topic one more time. This is part two of rethinking identity and representation in the time of the Renaissance. And again, as I noted, we'll look at this a little bit more in class when we start to talk about the transatlantic slave trade. But we do see a shift in the time period of the 1400s into the 1500s. One, we'll see the development of the transatlantic slave trade. So this starts with the movement of, say, Christopher Columbus, other individuals to go to the Americas. It's going to lead to colonization of certain European countries in the Americas, in the Caribbean, in South America, and North America. And a great deal of that will open the door for enslavement, which largely becomes race-based enslavement. And we see the transatlantic slave trade will move in the numbers of tens of thousands of Africans, to the Americas. And how and in what way this occurs is very connected to the thinking within societies in Spain and in other parts of Europe, Britain, for example, France, for example. So it is important to recognize the connection of slavery to European colonialism. And some of this is happening throughout Europe. So slavery exists in the 1400s. The time of the Renaissance is a time where slavery exists. It exists in other places too, so it's not unique to Europe. And again, it's not all race-based at this time in Europe, but we do have slave trade centers, for example, in Venice, which is a trading center as it is. And we do have particular documentation. One that's very notable is Zurara, who works for Henry the Navigator. Zurara is somebody who is a employee of the Portuguese nobility at the time. And in the writing of decisions that Henry the Navigator makes, Zurara does describe the way Africans are enslaved in Spain, and his description of this is often referred to as a racist idea because he specifically uses skin color to document and to codify a great deal of what slavery is about. So linking kind of race and slavery. This is something that comes from the work of Kendi, who is a modern day historian. The other community that I think it's important to just kind of get some perspective about is LGBTQ. This is often a group in society that we don't necessarily take the time to identify, but within the context of the Renaissance, there's actually a great deal of discrimination against this group. So in some cases, this discrimination also was very extensive in the Middle Ages. So this is not a group of people who were like the Moriscos, for example, who had a great deal of religious tolerance in the time period of the Middle Ages, living in the Islamic Empire, and then face kind of something that's very different when there's a change in the political system in the Iberian Peninsula. In the case of LGBTQ, this is largely seen as something deviant in the eyes, for example, of the church. And there had long been a variety of things that could fit into that category. So during the High Middle Ages, we see a lot of increased intolerance, persecution. So for the most part, this would be a largely invisible type of identity for people who were, identifying as like using our modern terms, LGBTQ. Of course, they didn't use those modern terms. The Spanish Inquisition might have included this, for example. And in typical Middle Ages fashion, burnings or stoning to death, could be commonplace, for anyone who was deemed a heretic, or deemed as somebody that wasn't following religious norms. To give you an example, we looked at Thomas Aquinas, who did have, kind of a description of what he described as same-sex relations in the time period. This is referred to as sodomy, but same-sex relations, were equated with murder. So, there is religious resistance to LGBTQ community. In the time period of the Renaissance, we do see some degree of uptick in activity, and we see this especially in Florence, but in other places too. So in our modern day, we see some historians, so Alan Bray, for example, Gary Ferguson, who are individuals who are writing about the significance of the LGBTQ community in the Renaissance. And as I noted before, some of what modern historians are doing is also connecting to topics that we are as a society talking about. So kind of keep that in mind. You know, history is viewed in a lens, and the lens is significant. So keeping that in mind in history is an important aspect of history. In the time of Florence, one of the things that happens is we see kind of a cultural social movement that becomes a little bit more progressive, to use that kind of term, in the way that there is increased identity of same-sex relationships, in particular between men. This was the place also in the Roman Empire, so some of this might be connected to kind of a, you know, some sort of emulation of ancient Rome. Some of this is also maybe justified through Plato and some ideas that Plato had about Platonic relationships. So there are some people who take the idea of Plato and bring it to a space that enables increased kind of changes in human relationships. Okay, so we do see an uptick in the like kind of publicness of same-sex relationships. It becomes notable and written about in Florence. And we also see at the same time that that happens, a committee of the night, which exists in Florence. It's kind of like a moral, judgment committee. So there's a great deal of discrimination. So over the course of the 1400s into the 1500s, lots of Florentines are brought in before the committee of the night. And this will include the likes of people like Leonardo, for example, who was brought in front of the committee. And even though not everyone, like Leonardo, is necessarily charged by the committee and stoned to death or anything like that, there are people who are executed in terms of the committee of the night. So it is important to kind of recognize some of the role that this particular issue played in Renaissance society, the way in which some debate occurred about this particular public activity and the increase in same-sex relationships, like in public, is part of the reason why we get these names. For example, Marsilio Ficino, who is very influential on Lorenzo de' Medici, was kind of one of the philosophers that was probably most influential on Lorenzo de' Medici. He's often called a somebody who was a like a somebody who was influential in Neoplatonic thought, so taking Plato's ideas and using them to describe, modern day society, modern day meaning the Renaissance society. And, he also is somebody that was documented to have a same-sex relationship. So there's a great deal of focus on his particular justification of same-sex relationships. And somebody who challenges that is Savonarola, who kind of takes down the Medici family and brings the attitude of Florence into a much more restrictive space. So this kind of, political change up that happens where there's a great deal of, kind of acceptance or tolerance for LGBTQ community is happening in Florence. And then you have a political change where that's not the case. And so we see in the 1400s a much more restrictive space that has a much more religious kind of overturn. And, to some degree, this is like a culture war in Florence. And again, it's of interest matters to a lot of modern historians because of the particular moment, we're in as a society. This is, we're talking about, 1,000 years ago, but yet some very similar conversations, between groups of people, right? And of course, there are many individuals that we could note who are part of the LGBT community. Historians largely agree. Francis Bacon, for example. And so lots of people that might be highlighted in this particular, kind of commentary. And when you think in terms of perspective and we think about, who was perhaps benefited by the Renaissance, where is there, individualism in the Renaissance, part of what this kind of perspectives thing gives us a sense of is there are lots of groups of people who largely do hide their individualism and their identity, in the time of the Renaissance, where it becomes, not accepted, to the point of, discrimination and essentially the death penalty at the time. There is a great deal of numbers of people who are possibly enslaved, possibly, stoned to death, or those sorts of things for, kind of being who they are, right? So kind of keep that in mind in terms of how you might examine some of the information in the McKay text. And, as like a, kind of a shout out for the McKay text, the McKay text is a textbook. And it is largely a textbook that has information. It does include, for example, the Committee of the Night. I think it's in the Middle Ages section of the McKay textbook. So where the focus of the Renaissance is and what McKay argues the Renaissance is doesn't necessarily suggest that, there's other places in the textbook where transatlantic slave trade is discussed, where there's other topics that relate to the kind of issues that happen in the Iberian Peninsula with Jews and Muslims, for example. So, the section that you have on the McKay text, it does not necessarily that the entire textbook doesn't include these various other perspectives, but it's interesting in a sense to kind of line up history sometimes where you consider the value of the Renaissance and also, some of these other kind of perspectives that are also arguably, the Renaissance. Although we don't tend to label them that way, they challenge perhaps some of what we think of when we think of, the time period of the Renaissance. Sometimes these other perspectives can get lost in the, art that we often look at, and it may be important to kind of consider these varieties of perspective. So I will leave you with that, and you can check out some of the sources that might be in that section where, can it be the case if we call a time period a Renaissance or a Golden Age, if not the entire society, experiences something, what does that, look like? Okay. And again, like all things, you get to draw your own conclusions, but we want to look at a full range of the arguments that historians propose about this time period of the Renaissance. Okay. Be well. I'll see you in class.